Welcome everyone to another episode of Product Paint Again. I'm really excited to have Urs Koenig here with me on this episode. Hi Urs.
Hey Felix, great to be here.
Urs is the author of the book Radical Humility, which is a fantastic book about modern leadership, but also changing your mind on how to approach leading a team, leading people, working with people. And yeah, in the next two episodes of this podcast, we will talk with Urs about his story of becoming a leader, his experiences, and what brought him to the point where he wrote a book about the topic. And in the second one, we will touch on core concepts and the ideas behind the book, which I think are absolutely fascinating, especially in product management, especially in startups where you build a team that needs to perform and that needs to be innovative and that needs to be creative. So, Urs, the first question, how did your career start and how did you kind of come across humility or come across the topic, basically?
Well, so I'm trying to not go too far back, Felix, but my career actually started in cross-country skiing. So during my university years, I was a competitive cross-country skiing athlete at the sort of collegiate level. And that in parallel to my experience in the armed forces. As you know, in Switzerland, we have a national service model. Everybody has to serve in the army. So those two experiences, being a leader at 20 in the armed forces and then being a more senior skier and a leader in the team, I was a part of the Swiss University ski team. That sort of was my first time I had formal leadership responsibility. And that actually these were formative years for me in terms of my own leadership. But then I traveled through academia, management consulting, started my own coaching business, went back into the military after having been out for 22 years and served in the Balkans. Actually, I served with a lot of Germans in Kosovo, and then went back for the UN 2 years ago and served in the Middle East. So a very eclectic background I have in leadership, but I always really was digging leadership in all the different positions I've had, even if I didn't have formal leadership responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So kind of starting your leadership experience very early on, kind of especially in the military, I could imagine that the hierarchical leadership kind of has very little to do with humility, or am I wrong about that?
Well, you're not wrong. So I think I don't think, I know when I was serving back, whatever it is now, 30 plus years ago, when I first had to serve in the national service, humility was certainly not talked about in the military, and there was much less lived on the ground. There's no question. In fact, I almost got kicked out of officer school because I was laughing at the colonel, who was very obviously drunk while giving me orders. And so that almost kicked me out. So I didn't really suffer fools very well, even at that young age. But then actually important. So certainly humility was not lived on the ground. But then my two peacekeeping missions, as I mentioned, over the course of the last 5 to 6 years, actually, ironically, going back into what everybody thinks is a hierarchical environment, actually showed me that now the best military leaders, the best commanders I had, were actually deeply humble commanders. They had deep self-awareness. They built meaningful relationships with their team members, and they built, we'll talk about in the second episode, psychological safety, a fearless team. So while lots of people think in the military to this day it's just command control, transactional, do so because I tell you so, it's not actually the case anymore at all. The best commanders in the military are deeply humble. And, I'm not the only person who's postulating that. General McChrystal wrote the outstanding book, Team of Teams. We have David Marquette out of the Navy, turned the ship around. So there's definitely a cultural shift happening, not only in the business world, but also in the military.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So kind of coming from the sports teams and then also the military background, moving into a corporate environment, right? And you talked about like consultancy firms, you talked about those like typical corporate environments. Did that work out for you, or was that a challenge? What was your experience there?
So that was a challenge. I write about this in the book. I got fired from a a corporate job I had because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. So, which is, that's my own. We all are work in progress. I wrote the book on humble leadership, and we're all work in progress. I have to get better at it every single day myself. There's no question about it. We're all on this journey. So I love teams. I love leadership. I also, and this is very personal, I hope that's okay sharing, I'm very independent. I'm fiercely independent. I love calling my own shots as well. And I like to have a lot of flexibility because I have a lot of different interests in my life. And so the corporate world, management consulting in particular, where, 80, 90, 100-hour weeks, no say over your own schedule. To answer your question directly, that didn't work out for me. So that was not my thing. So I went out, 20 plus years ago and started my own gig as an executive coach in leadership development. And to this day, I'm out now primarily as a keynote speaker, doing it on my own. But, everything comes, it's an opportunity cost everywhere. So I love my independence. I love calling my own shots. But at the same time, I miss being part of a team. So that is actually not always straightforward to me as a solopreneur to not be part of a team. So the missions I did, the military missions actually fulfilled that need to some extent because, even for a defined period of time, for a year, you're part of a team that works towards a bigger cause. And by the way, also as a leadership development expert consultant, to go back in to the military and live in my client's shoes, like how healthy is that, right? With peers, with directs, with two bosses, matrix organization, the whole shazam. So I really loved going back and experiencing it yet again for myself and being a leader for myself.
Very interesting. So kind of looking at the environment, looking at the landscape out there, and you being in a consulting position also kind of for leaders and for managers, how many are practicing radical humility? What do you encounter out there?
That's a tough one to put an exact number on. So what I can tell you is that it's not just me saying that, there is a significant increase in the number of research papers, in the number of articles written on the importance of humility in leadership. And a variety of reasons for that. COVID, I believe, was one of the contributing factors to that. But now if you look at leaders like, Satya Nadella from Microsoft, like he has humility, growth mindset, written all over him. But, if I had to answer your question, I would say that about 2/3 of the leaders I encounter are receptive to the idea. And it depends on the industry, by the way. So, and maybe 1/3 is very reserved, and I need a lot of convincing and a lot of discussions to sort of, get them there. But and again, this is not a correct sign and not an totally accurate number, but about 2/3 of the folks are definitely receptive to it. And, and the best ways to approach it is if a manager, as a leader, has pain points, turnover, they lose their best team members, the customers leave, whatever, like that is like, okay, let's do the root cause analysis and how can a humble leadership approach actually address the pain points. I mean, that's the way, as you well know, right? I need to pick you up where you are and pick up your pain points, and then we can unpack it together. And maybe humility, a more humble leadership approach is the solution. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's something totally different. So, I too come, to be clear, Felix, I come at this with a great amount of humility. Look, I have written the book. I love the concept. I know it's powerful. I've done the research, and there's a million other, intelligent people out there like me who think and talk and write about leadership and who have different approaches. And, situational leadership has long taught us that there's a lot of different ways to get to the end goal.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Like even with the concept, you can show humility, which increases acceptance, right? But we will talk about that in the second episode. Do you think it changed like kind of how people see the topic? Because I'm working in a kind of in like my career is like 15 years. In those 15 years, I experienced already a shift in how leadership is seen as is it something where you command and control versus involve people and show vulnerability and show humility? I've seen that shift already in those 15 years, but also on a bigger scale, the expectation towards leaders has changed. I remember still conversations where like 10, 15 years ago, we were like, we want the boss to tell us what to do and we want X, Y, Z, right? Where now I hear people say, I would like to be involved, or it's a different mindset. Well, how's your kind of experience over the shift there?
Look, I love, Felix, what you're telling me here, because that is in line, frankly, with my experience and also what the research is showing us. So over the last, let's call it 15 years, right? 15, maybe 20 years. Back then, still command control. When I started my career, do so because I tell you to do so. Command, the boss, I call it heroic leadership. The boss has to have all the answers, knows it all, do it all. But then let's look at the two main forces that have changed. Well, lots of forces have changed over the last 15 to 20 years, but everything's moving faster. The world's become more complex. We don't need to get into all the various, things that are accelerating. The AI is just the latest one. Leading in today's world is by definition humbling. No one person can know it all or do it all. As the boss, we have an inversion of expertise. Our people, by definition, always know more, and they need to know more about their specific area of expertise. I can't know it all, and so I need to build an environment where they feel empowered to, execute to their best abilities, to their best judgment, and where they feel safe to come to me as a leader with the data and information I rely on as their leader. And the only way that happens is if we build trusting and meaningful relationships, which, is one of the core elements of leading with humility. So I would argue one of the driving forces between them for this shift towards a more humble leadership approach is, in fact, that our world has become more complex, is moving faster at a higher speed. So that's number one. Number two is, you just mentioned the workforce. People want meaning. They want purpose, right? There's so much research. We don't have to, re-quote all this, but, Gen Zs, they want money. Yes, they do want money, but give me the purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? And so I need to, and also, by the way, they want collaborative relationships. A recent study showed actually that young folks who have a best friend at work doesn't mean the best friend, but a best friend at work are 7 times more likely to hang around. Okay, and talent shortage, retention is a huge challenge for many of us in our businesses. And so the young generation, the younger folks, want meaningful relationships at work. And again, that is, how do I build meaningful relationships? I show up with a bit of vulnerability. That builds connection. If I, as the boss, I know we'll talk about that more in the second episode. If I have to, as the boss, admit that I don't have all the answers, I have some, like, that builds connection. I'm becoming a human. I'm not just a command control boss. So again, faster moving world, a generational shift. For the first time now, we have 4 generations in the workforce. Like, these two driving forces in my book have been behind the shift towards a more humble leadership approach.
Very interesting. Especially the 4 generations topic is quite interesting. Do you experience that difference between like a Gen Z and a baby boomer? Do they have different expectations toward humble leadership, or are all of them open for that concept, for that idea?
This, that's I would argue that, in my experience, the older folks like me, are maybe more reserved because we grew up in a different environment. And so I have some, of my speaking clients where they sort of feel, look, I had to go through this, so you should too, right? So there's this notion of like, I had to eat hard bread, so, so should the younger generation. Mm-hmm. So I would argue that that maybe it is in general a bit harder for the more seasoned folks, simply because they were brought up and learned their profession and started their career in a different environment. But this is an oversimplification and overgeneralization. There's certainly people, in the older generation who are amazing humble leaders. I mean, I talk about some folks in my book, who've been around for a long time, who are deeply humble, and conversely, of course, not to be crass, but you have young, arrogant jerks as well. So that happens as well. So
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's always a question, right? I grew up with a father who was born 48 and was a hippie, right? So my father is absolutely humble in that regard. And I grew up with the father asking me as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old for suggestions just to teach me to think myself, right? But very, very interesting way of teaching, I would say. Whereas, of course, like generations do mean nothing, but still kind of, if we talk about a shift from what is perceived as good leadership and what is expected from a leader, definitely changed. I'm really interested in kind of what the impact of generations are, but also like looking at humility as a concept. How would you see acceptance of this kind of in different cultures? I mean, you worked in different countries. Is there a difference kind of culture-wise, and especially now, and then we can talk about also mixed teams, right? How would you approach that? That's an interesting question also, I think.
Yes, it is. So you're right. So there's actually a couple of things, and again, I'm coming at this with great humility. Since I published a book, which was in March of this year, I've done a lot of the things we're doing right now, podcasts. I've gone out there on speaking platforms and engaging with a lot of people around my content. And it is with great humility that I actually state that there's one thing I didn't cover enough in the book. And that is that for some of us, it is more difficult to show up with humility for, you mentioned one reason, cultural backgrounds. Mm-hmm. Also, typically more marginalized groups. So I will never forget, I had a podcast interview just like you and I do right now with an African-American female former corporate executive in the States. She's now doing executive coaching and is a podcaster as well. And she pushed back and said, look, that's all very nice and good. If I would have shown up with humility and with a bit of vulnerability, which is part of humility, in my corporate career as an African-American female executive, I would have been out the door next day, because every single day I had to prove my worth every single day. And so I think there's that going on. So I think the notion that humility can be harder for some of us because we're maybe part of a more marginalized group. Similarly, culturally, I will never forget when I did my performance review of my interpreters in the Balkans and in the Middle East. I had them self-assess, like how they self-assess in their performance. They self-assessed 5 out of 5 on every single line item. I'm the best at everything. I'm like, seriously? Like, you have nothing to improve? And so that's a cultural difference. You go, why would I admit to my boss like that I have something I need to get better at? And then we, because we had a good relationship, we could joke about it and actually point to the cultural difference. So absolutely, there is differences across cultures. I'm not a specialist in that, but there's certainly a lot of research done, where we have flatter, cultures, more egalitarian. Some of the Nordic countries come to mind. Maybe Switzerland and Germany is maybe still a bit more hierarchical. And certainly you go to do business in Japan, and even though it's changed a lot as well, but it's still, you're judged by the size of your business card. I bow however deep I bow based on the title on the business card. So these are, sort of fun little anecdotes, but there's certainly differences across cultures and, again, marginalized groups, no question about it.
Absolutely. And that's quite an interesting, especially if we then talk about how to put it into practice, an interesting kind of area, because you need to adjust your style and your communication heavily to, especially if you're multinational or international teams, right?
No question about it. I mean, that's why I always say, leadership is a thinking person sport. We need to think. It's a thinking person sport. We need to read the room. You're exactly right. And pick up on what comes back. And then we need to also have the courage across all cultures, I would put forward, to actually explicitly call our challenges out, and checking in, how does that land with you? And then making it explicit. And it might be uncomfortable to some extent, but bringing it up in a respectful and in a collaborative way mean, that is and I'm not a cross-cultural expert, but that is in my book, the way to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that very empowering also for the teams, because in essence, what you do with that is you show them that their opinion is important for you, right? That's such a cool side effect of doing it this way, which I totally love. Okay, so kind of for the end of this episode, where we wanted to talk about the bigger topic and kind of the origins and how it fits into this world. What is your belief? Where's this kind of topic going? What is the future looking for radical humility or for humble leadership?
Where is it going? Well, I hope it's gonna really take off, and I'm on a mission to be part of that. I truly believe, and I know this sounds, maybe a bit grandiose, but I truly believe that a more humble leadership approach. By the way, we don't have to talk about politics, and we won't, but despite of what's going on in the political scene in some of our countries, I believe that humility, a more humble leadership approach, is the way forward. And I actually believe that a more humble leadership approach makes for better leaders, which in turn makes for a better world. I mean, literally, again, this might sound a bit grandiose, but if I can, if I'm in leadership, if some of your listeners are in leadership positions where they themselves lead leaders, if I can influence my leaders to lead in a more human-centered, humble way, that will spill over into their teams, that will spill over into their families, into the communities, and it can really make a difference well beyond our immediate sphere of influence. So I do actually believe that, humble leadership makes for better leaders and can make for a better world. And so I don't know what the future brings, Felix, but I sure hope that humility will be front and center in terms of the future of leadership, and I'm on a mission to get us there.
Absolutely. This is such an amazing mission. I totally love it. Let's support it. Also, for those who are listening, I think spreading the word and making sure that we take a little bit of that. It's not a binary thing, right? If you do it a little bit, it already helps. That's the cool thing about it. And bringing that a bit to the world, I think, is so powerful. Thanks a lot, Urs. I'm looking forward to the second episode, where we'll now dive deeper into how to bring it into our daily business and how to bring it to the teams we are working with.
Thanks, Felix.